Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this is a very special day. It's the full moon of July, Asalha Puja day, and this is significant in Theravada Buddhist tradition, in which we assume that the history that the Buddha actually gave his first sermon to his 5 colleagues at Tisarana on this full moon of July. And so it's always a pleasure for me to expound on this sermon. The Four Noble Truths is generally known because it's been my whole guide to practice for 56, 57 years now. Because when I became interested in Buddhism when I was about 21, it was Zen Buddhism. And then in Theravada, Zen Buddhism mostly it challenges your intellect and it didn't prepare me for the kind of basic teachings that originated by the Buddha. So when I went to live in Thailand, that being a Theravada Buddhist country, it gave me opportunity to practice. So the first year when I was a samanera, I spent in a forest monastery, and they gave me a kuti to live in. I was a samanera, a novice monk, for a whole year, and gave me this opportunity for that year to meditate, use the Four Noble Truths as my basis for understanding what the Buddha was really teaching. And I had this kind of investigating mind which likes to investigate things. What is the Dhamma that we take refuge in, or Buddha and Sangha, rather than becoming just a traditional Theravada monk according to custom. But if this was the first sermon after enlightenment, we assumed the Buddha was fully enlightened when he gave this sermon. It was always it was kind of mysterious and enigmatic that he would establish his first sermon on the experience of suffering. So this is difficult to explain. I remember in London, I was very active in the kind of interfaith movement years ago, and you'd have interfaith meetings, and most religions are theistic, so they come from a divine force, a God that loves us all, and so you're talking from this very high point about God and love, and it's very inspiring. And you hear these kind of different religious leaders talking about God and love. But I was brought up as a Christian, so I had enough of that as a boy about God and love, but I didn't find it in any practical way in my life. I didn't, it was inspired words and made you feel that kind of inspiration and interest, but it didn't take you anywhere other than you didn't know how to go about this spiritual search. So in the Four Noble Truths, because the First Noble Truth is established on the most ordinary human emotion that everybody experiences, is suffering. And so it's easy to assume that the Buddha taught that everything is suffering, which is rather a depressing, it doesn't inspire the mind. Everything's suffering, so, make the best of it is kind of a defeatist attitude. Doesn't particularly inspire the mind. But in that year, in this monastery in Nong Khai, I was left pretty much to myself. I had no knowledge of Thai language, and the head monks there couldn't speak any English. But I had this one book called Word of the Buddha, which takes the Tripitaka, which is very large and clumsy to carry around with you, to just a very small pamphlet. And it was arranged by a German bhikkhu in Sri Lanka, Nyanatiloka. And it gives you all the important teachings from the suttas. So because being alone for a year, when you've never experienced that in your life, you've always been with somebody, there's always distractions available at every turn, and so I found, being alone at first was quite pleasant. So I enjoyed a few days of bliss of just being alone and not putting under any kind of social pressures. And then I started, and I learned this one system of meditation of the Burmese method, Mahasi system, when I was a layman in Bangkok. But it's a very strict kind of system, rigidly bound to slow motion and labeling. And so I found that this was, I could do this for a while, but 24/7, and it was impossible. And, so I could have periods where I did this formal practice, but then the rest of the time I didn't know what to do. And so I found during this time, the first few months, this sense of, just incredible anger arising in me that had nothing to do with the surrounding conditions, because everybody was very respectful. They'd bring me good food every day, and so, it wasn't anger toward anything immediate, the monastery or the other monks, but just repressed anger over, I was about 31 years old at the time. So that, just trying to do this very effective method of mindfulness, it didn't make me deal with anger very well, because I didn't understand what was happening. And so later on, I took to looking at this book called Word of the Buddha and studied the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth, as I've said before, was suffering, or dukkha. So this was, and this is what I was experiencing, suffering. And so that gave me a sense of looking at what's happening right now, rather than trying to resist anger and resentment, which was my habit, my personal habit, how I dealt with negativity as a layperson for 30 years. So this is like suddenly the First Noble Truth, became something of interest to me, because, I couldn't blame the suffering on the circumstances. I was being treated well, and I didn't have anything to complain about, and nobody was being mean or nasty to me in any way. And so, I began to, and then of the three insights into the First Noble Truth is to understand suffering. So then the English word understand, I knew what suffering is, you could, but one always tended to blame suffering, take it very personally, something wrong with oneself, or blame it on external conditions, on parents, on teachers, on disappointing situations. And so the whole conditioning, cultural conditioning, was to blame my suffering on external causes. And but in this case, it was to understand suffering, which seemed to give a more profound meaning to the word understand. Because suddenly, I didn't feel a necessity to blame the suffering, but on anybody around me, or on past experiences, because the suffering was apparent here and now, is what I felt. Being alone, not understanding the customs, not speaking the language, having nobody to talk to, no radios, no iPhones, no television, just alone in this little hut in the forest with this one book. So it gave this book great significance in my life, because I couldn't distract myself through reading literature or other things. I just had this one small pamphlet, really, on the Buddhist teachings. So I began to observe suffering as experience, and understand it in a way of like standing under it, accepting suffering, looking at it, rather than trying to get rid of it or blame the suffering on other causes. So this was quite a new experience, an insight actually. These three aspects to the First Noble Truth are all insights. So I had this insight to just observe this sense of misery, of loneliness, of dread of the future, resentments toward the past, and on like that. Then the second Noble Truth, the third aspect to the First Noble Truth, is suffering has been understood. So that was like a insight, affirmation, that you now change from just thinking of suffering in the worldly way that I understood the word before, into looking at understanding that suffering is about, is an experience that we all have in this form as a human being. So, and so I had this sense that suffering has been understood. So these Four Noble Truths, that's the First Noble Truth, and three aspects to every truth. which is, the first aspect is what we might call in Pali Bhariyati Dhamma. It's understanding the words that you get from the scripture, and then Bhatipata, which is practicing, which is the advice is to understand suffering, and then the third insight is suffering has been understood. I had this confidence that I now understood what the Buddha meant by understanding suffering. I was looking here, toward my mind itself, toward my body and mind, rather than out there, and trying to find the causes of suffering through looking at things or remembering incidents, unpleasant incidents in my life. So then the second noble truth was very powerfully appreciated because because many of us here we're not brought up in Buddhist culture or Buddhist parents. So, like many of us were brought up in a Judeo-Christian cultural setting, Western scientific values were greatly generated towards science, psychology, and these are all outward-going subjects. So in Christianity, God is something out there, way above you, and so that's why it's difficult to relate to that as anything practical, other than you're told to strictly believe in it. But if you've got a skeptical tendency, then you can't just believe because your parents and the priests tell you should. You're fighting with yourself, endlessly trying to force the issue and make yourself believe in things that don't make any sense to you anymore. So the causes of suffering. So suffering is a noble truth because it leads to non-suffering. Now that's very inspiring, non-suffering. So it's not a depressing kind of nihilistic teaching, everything is miserable and just do the best you can with it, kind of resigned to fate and life in this mortal form. But you begin to educate yourself by investigating the causes of suffering. So the causes of suffering, and there are three aspects. And the first aspect is, the causes are desire, and three kinds of desire. Kama tanha, which is sensual desire, which is easily understandable, what you see or hear, smell, taste, touch, and think, is the object of the senses. And when we see something beautiful, we're attracted to it, we desire it. When we see something ugly, we want to get rid of it, whether it's what we see or think or feel. We want the beautiful, the pleasant, and we don't want its opposite. So, Kama tanha, and this word tanha is a Pali word, and desire in English always has a kind of pejorative meaning. When we say someone has a lot of desires, it's usually related to sensual desire, to sexual desire, or to some form of greed. So desire, as I use that word generally as a layman, was more like something you want to get rid of. You're told to, you have all these moral precepts about restraint with action and speech, and trying to control these desires, sexual desire or greed for things, and so you're brought up in this very dualistic moral attitude about controlling, resisting, and fighting the evil forces. And but in this case, the Buddha, gives you this invitation to understand three kinds of desire. As I said before, Gamadana, sensual desire, and Bhavadanha is the second one, which is very interesting because it's not, we want to become enlightened. When I ordained, became a Buddhist monk because I wanted to be enlightened. I wanted to be free from suffering. I wanted to become an arahant. I was never thought I was good enough to become a Buddha, but I thought maybe I could make arahant at this lifetime. So desiring to, as you read the scriptures, you have these terms like stream enterer and twice returner, non-returner, and completely liberated individual called an arahant. So these words are inspiring, and they make you want to attain them. And so with Bhavadanha, the desire to get something you don't have, to become something you're not. And I could see, that I could begin to witness that in myself, how my practice was trying to get rid of the bad side, the ugly side, and trying to find happiness, permanent happiness or bliss or enlightenment. And so, in terms of meditation experiences, I had moments of great bliss through concentration practice on sending your consciousness to an object or to the breath, and you get very peaceful that way. And so, I tried to develop that as my path, but I found, it was very temporary because it's easily disrupted. And it made me cranky if people disrupted my meditation. So I found that, I was becoming incredibly selfish. Don't slam the door, be careful, walk silently, don't make a noise because I'm meditating. And I started witnessing, putting it into words like that, began to see, it was me as a person, a separate person, wanting to control the world so I could have this blissful state, and then feeling upset when the conditions changed and doors were slamming and people weren't nice to me anymore and things like that. You couldn't sustain this silent concentration, because it was easily distracted. And also the big distraction to samatha is doubt. And if you think a lot, you doubt a lot. And I was an obsessed thinker. So I'd get very concentrated and then I think, is this first jhana? And then the whole thing would collapse. Because is this first jhana is a doubt. And so, I realized I was getting nowhere with that. But in terms of desire, this investigation of bhavadanha, I began to see how my ego was very much based on trying to get something I didn't have, an enlightenment I didn't have, so I wanted it. I wanted happiness, which I didn't feel. And so, I'm meditating for happiness and for peace because I didn't feel happy or peaceful. So I began to have a way of looking, understanding bhavadanha a desire to get something I didn't have as something to let go of, because the insight into this second noble truth is to let go. So this was, I started practicing letting go, just saying the words. When these both sensual desire and desire to get something I didn't have, to let go of it. And then the third type of desire, vipawadana, is very much how I related to life, trying to get rid of things, resist things. I could see so much of my life had been spent learning to resist life, trying to control it and resist the unpleasantness of it. And so this gave me a reference to the desire to get rid of things I didn't want. So these three kinds of desire give you, both the sensory experiences that we have through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and their objects. So they depend on each other. The eyes depend on objects, to function, or the ears to hear sounds, and the nose to smell odors and things like that. So the objects and the senses themselves, are something that are in this continuous changiness. They try to sustain, sensory object, and that the mind wanders away. And so, and just trying to get rid of bhavadana, trying to convince myself I don't care whether I'm enlightened or not, that was not really letting go of it. It was trying to perfect my personality, my ego, and because I was always operating from that position. How I interpreted Pali scriptures was from the ego, from the sense of me as a separate person, trying to understand the translations of Pali into English. And so this insight, letting go, was very powerful, because suddenly I had, I could actually use just the words, English words, let go, as a kind of mantra. When I get stuck into these three kinds of desires, I began to witness desire as an object rather than as seeing it as a personal quality. So this is shifting from the very personal experience we have by identifying with the body. It makes everything incredibly personal. I am this physical body. I'm this gender. I'm a male. It's a male body. I'm a male. I'm Caucasian. I'm a certain age. I'm an American, and on all the identities that I acquired that create this sense of a unique, separate self, a separate personality. And so just this investigation of kamadana, bhavadana, vipawadana, suddenly you're shifting from just trying to control desires and trying to make yourself, fix yourself into kind of a perfect ideal. You're actually letting go of things by just observing that kamadana is like this, desire for sense pleasures is like this, rather than I shouldn't desire sense pleasures, I'm a samanera, I'm celibate, I shouldn't desire things and operating from the personality that I had, to seeing that Kama Dana was something that would come and go. It wasn't permanent. Bhava Dana, became confused, because if I'm not trying to get enlightened, what am I doing? If there's nobody trying to get enlightened, who am I? And so I shouldn't even try to get enlightened. So I spent a year as a samanera, because I didn't want to follow the desire to become a bhikkhu. I was trying to be perfect. And then the Vipavadana was an amazing insight, because I saw so much of my repressed anger and resentment I learned how to repress negativity from early childhood. I learned how to play the game of being a good boy and repress the negative, bad boy. And so, always trying to get good grades in school, please your parents, and obey the teachers made me operate quite well in the worldly system, but it didn't bring any real happiness, because so much of your life you're resisting it, trying to stop that negative, say the bad boy side of the human psyche. So then I began to just practice letting go. Then I met this monk, a disciple of Luang Por Sumedho, who was on Tudong, going on wandering. He came up to Nong Khai and stayed at the monastery, and he's the one that told me to ordain as a bhikkhu and go and live with Luang Por Sumedho in Ubud, who I never heard of before. So waiting that year in Nong Khai was a great gift to me, because at that time in Thailand, like in Bangkok, nobody mentioned Luang Por Sumedho. It's completely unknown in the central Thailand at that time. It was 1966, 67. So I asked my upachaya, the head monk of the province in Nong Khai. He ordained me as a bhikkhu and sent me off to live with Luang Por Sumedho. And so from there, the third noble truth, I had, this is how I see it, remembering the past, is I had insight already into the first two noble truths. So when Luang Por Sumedho the first month I was there with Luang Por Sumedho, there were two Thai monks who could speak English, who could translate. So Ajahn Chah would invite me to his kuti every afternoon, and then through translation we discuss. He'd tell me how he taught, and he seemed to appreciate my insights. So it gave me a lot of confidence in Ajahn Chah as a teacher. And the first monk I met, who I really regarded as a teacher, as my teacher. So that's why I stayed there, why I stayed at Wat Pah Pong. And during the year, those 10 years with Luang Por Sumedho, he was constantly speaking from the Four Noble Truths position. So I could really appreciate, when I learned to understand the language, I was mesmerized by Luang Por Sumedho's talks. He was only 48, 49 years old at the time, and I was, really found he was giving reflections every morning, every evening, and that kind of teaching, the way he told me to be the Puto, the witness. So I changed the mantra from let go to Puto, which is the way the Thais pronounce Buddha. They say Buddha. So, for a Westerner, you think of, it sounds a bit funny. So Puto sounded a bit funny, but that's what I was hearing. And so I used Puto as a kind of method, a mantra, to let go once, because it's a witnessing position, not a controlling position. Like Buddha knows the way things are. Buddha is this knowing the way it is. It's like this. So you have these teachings like all conditions are impermanent. So the Buddha actually gave forth the ultimate teaching. All conditions are impermanent. All Dhamma is not a person, not a personal sense. So it's anatta, no self, which sounds very dogmatic, absolutely no self, as if, and that's how the Westerners oftentimes interpret anatta, rather than all Dhamma is not a person, not a separate self. So then during those 10 years I had insights into Nirodha, just through the encouragement that Luang Por Cha gave me. And so Nirodha is the end of suffering. That's the third noble truth. And so Nirodha means, the first noble truth is suffering. Nirodha is the end of suffering. So training as a Buddhist monk in Wapapong gave me many opportunities to suffer, because you feel very, the only Westerner in this Thai monastery in a remote part of Thailand, and then you're trying to learn a language, get used to the very strict Vinaya practices, and food was, at that time was quite just the village diet, really, from local villages. And, I could create suffering around all of this, the frustration of not understanding what's going on most of the time, being a subject of interest. Everybody wanted to look at me, and because I was an American bhikkhu, which was totally new experience for everyone at that time, and trying to, and then in northeast Thailand they speak a dialect of Thai, northeastern Thai, Lao language, more like Lao, and so you're learning Thai from a tape recorder. I had a tape recorder, Central Thai, like what they speak in Bangkok, but all you're hearing is Isan Thai, Northeast Thai. So, it's a tonal language, like Chinese. So you have to develop a new sense for sound, for tones of words. So, it was a very frustrating experience for me. And then the Thai monks they're very rigid about how you had to sit and carry yourself, and your right place in the line, in the queue, everything was, I was constantly being admonished. And, being a 31, 32-year-old American male that wanted to do things as he felt was very, really contrasted with creating negative states of mind. But Luang Por Cha's advice to me was to be the Puto, the witness to the frustration or the aversion or the anger or the resentment that would arise during this training period. So that I found really helpful, because I could witness, I could actually observe my anger or frustration, and with this attitude of letting go. And so I used that, and then as I became more adjusted to the system and understood the language, then of course I fitted in. I learned to adapt and fit into the new customs and the restraint of Vinaya, which was, gave me a new experience with being very responsible for what I said and how I used my body for action and speech. So I began to experience, by observing things, by witnessing, by this Puto witnessing practice, I began to observe frustration arise. And then you don't try to let go of it in a sense of getting rid of it. You just let it be what it is. You sit with it until it ceases. So I began to actually witness the end of suffering in little ways, in just moments where, something that I would really wind me up and I'd get carried away with either following it or trying to resist it. I became just a passive witness, a Puto, to the existing conditions, and its presence is like this. And then with patience and acceptance, it goes to cessation, it goes to Nirodha. So then I had the experience of Nirodha, the end of suffering. So that's to be cultivated. And that's the insight into Nirodha, to cultivate what they call bhavana, which leads to the fourth noble truth, what they call the Eightfold Path, the way of non-suffering. And that way of non-suffering is right understanding, right intention, right action, right speech, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So Eightfold Path sounds rather, when you're thinking in steps, like the first step, right understanding, is samadhi, right understanding. So you understand the words. And then through trusting your insights into the first three noble truths, you have insight into right understanding. What that is, it isn't verbal. It's not like now I understand everything and I can know exactly what right understanding is and describe it to people. But that this path, this Eightfold Path, is really where the consciousness is aware of itself. It's no longer just going out towards objects and being aware of objects. So usually our mindfulness is going to objects, being aware of them. When you're driving a car, you have to, be aware of the stop signs and pedestrian crossings and things like that. That you're sending consciousness through the sight, through the eyes, to the object, in order to survive physically, to not hurt yourself or anyone else, or demolish the car. So this sense of samadhi then begins to really, rather than seeing it in 8 steps, it's called 8-fold, so it's not like steps. So they come together, everything comes together with samadhi. Then the right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so forth operate from that. The Vinaya is a form to help us be mindful of speech and action. Helps us to, give us boundaries for what we say and what we do with our bodies. But the intention for Vinaya is not to just make yourself controlled and bound to precepts, but to encourage awareness, sati sampajanya. So you see Vinaya as much more a helpful tool rather than a rigid set of precepts that you have to obey in order to be right. You begin to understand the wisdom, why the Buddha did establish the Vinaya tradition. So then the Nirodha, the end of suffering, like in the present situation I'm in now, the having an old body, and I've just recovered from the COVID flu. All these are suffering, having an old body that doesn't operate all that well, and then getting the flu was desperately trying to prevent myself from being infected by COVID. There's so much people protecting me from this dreaded pandemic. And was it suffering? Was COVID pandemic suffering for me? People are interested. Somebody's meditating all these years, how do you deal with COVID? And, the unpleasantness of it was just natural. The body's like this. It's a sensitive form. It's going to feel good and it's going to feel terrible according to conditions. Old age, sickness, death is just a part of the karma of a human body. Once born, it's just going to get older and get sick and die. So the identity, that's the nature of these forms that we give so much importance to and identify with. And that's why there's so much suffering in affluent countries like Canada and the United States, in Britain, Western European countries, very affluent countries, well run, and still there's an enormous amount of mental anguish and despair and anxiety because of the identity with the body. The body can be threatened by outside sources. It's a very delicate form, easily damaged, and so we learn to try to protect ourselves. But when we do get sick, did I suffer when I had COVID? I felt the discomfort of it, but I didn't create suffering in my mind. So that was the difference. The body is going to feel pain, and that's, it's a painful condition, basically. The human form is totally sensitive form, out in the open, in space, and it's going to suffer the changing conditions that we have no control over. So is the end of suffering that you don't feel any more pain or don't suffer from disease? You don't create suffering around the way things are. You're letting go. You're not attached to conditions. You experience them when they arise and cease, but you're no longer bound. You're no longer blindly clinging to them, holding on, grasping them, and trying to control them, get rid of the unpleasant ones, and try to hold all the good things to try to keep them. So Western society, it's a good sign, like the monastery here at Tisarana. It's a good sign that this Buddhist monastery has suddenly appeared in this part of Canada, because it is a sign that it gives promise and hope to life. There is a way to end suffering. Just trying to find the perfect government, the perfect politicians, the perfect prime minister, the perfect systems, and trying to resolve all our suffering through psychology, are good attempts. They're all ideals to try to create democratic, free societies is a beautiful ideal. But an ideal isn't the way life is. Life as we experience is not for anyone is it ideal. It's the way it is. It's changing. And so when all conditions are impermanent, sape sankhara anicca, that teaching I've always referred to, and all conditions are impermanent because they are. That's their nature. So sankharas are, unstable, uncertain conditions that change, that we try to find certainty and stability and safety in things that are their very natures to change. And that's why we get cynical or bitter about life, because it just doesn't seem fair that when we work hard and pay our taxes and all that we should suffer. On a logical, reasonable level, it's true. We should, everybody should be rewarded for being good and punished for being bad. But that's not always the way things are. And then the biggest fear is death itself. What happens when we die? And I'm sure Ajahn Virdhamma's been asked this many times. I have, certainly, because everybody's interested, And, I usually say, well, I haven't died yet, so I don't really know. But there are various versions, if you've been good, you go to heaven. If you've been bad, you go to hell. And then there's reincarnation, which is an Asian teaching. And if you've been a really nasty human being, you're reborn as a toad or a snake, something deplorable. And if you've been very good, you go to heaven. And different in Buddhist cosmology. There's different levels of heaven you go to. So these are all heavens. They're always desirable, and what they call the abhaya states are all undesirable. So, just in the cosmology, the tradition, Indian cosmology, rebirth, they call it reincarnation, or you can call it rebirth, which is a much better word, actually, because we're constantly being reborn all the time. As you begin to observe, be the puto, the witness to the way things are, you notice just how many cessations of personal feelings cease, and then you're reborn again as something else. So it's learning to really let go of sankharas. You're not getting rid of them, it's not annihilation. It's not trying to control by precepts anymore, but it's through seeing for yourself the suffering that is the result of clinging to sankharas. All conditions are impermanent. And Dhamma is not a person, a separate person. So it's, and that word, Dhamma, when we chant in the morning, evening pujas, we translate, when we talk about the qualities of Dhamma, we say Santitiko Dhamma, which translates into English as apparent here and now. And what is apparent here and now? And so you begin to investigate. Apparent here and now is whatever state you're in, whether you have COVID, pandemic, flu, or you're perfect physical health, or everybody loves you or nobody likes you. What's apparent here and now under all conditions is you're conscious. You're conscious. That's apparent here and now. That's one of the qualities of Dhamma. So Dhamma is here and now. And it's timeless, akaliko Dhamma. Try to imagine timelessness. You can imaging, imagination is all about time, what arises and ceases. Timelessness you can't imagine. So we call it eternity, which oftentimes in the West is translated time that never ends. But is eternity timelessness here and now? And so in Nirodha you realize this timeless reality. You can't find it, you can't imagine it, but it's apparent here and now, timeless. Ehipassiko, like it's in Pali, to come and see for yourself. It's like being invited to, come in, look right now, here and now, timeless. So it's not like a hidden mystery that only highly advanced, spiritually advanced people can realize. Upanayaka Dhamma, you're going inward rather than sending your consciousness through the senses to the objects. You're still conscious, but there's no object in it. You can't objectify consciousness. Nirodha has no words. You call it emptiness, which makes it sound rather negative. Or you put it in terms of bliss, peace, bliss, the more useful words for describing Nirodha, the end of suffering. And then Panchitang Vaitidapovanu, he's the last quality to be experienced individually. So this afternoon, one of the monks was talking about me being able to just zap you and make your life. And it's not that I don't want to do that, it's I can't do it. So even the Buddha, according to the scriptures, couldn't do that. So instead of zapping the 5 colleagues, he gave them the Four Noble Truths. So this is a celebration of this first teaching of the Dhammacakka Sutta, which I encourage you all to use and investigate. It's an inquiry into existence, into experience, and conscious awareness. So it's not just memorizing Four Noble Truths and thinking you understand them, but what is Nirodha in the reality? What is the reality of Nirodha, or the Eightfold Path? Or what is dukkha? Why is it foremost in the first position of the Four Noble Truths? So the end of suffering is here and now, apparent here and now. And then we use the word Dhamma, refuge in Dhamma. So I offer this as a reflection for today.
Namaya Dhammakata Satu Karankatamase
Sadhu Sadhu